Welcome, everybody. We're going to be talking about CMMC and Enclaves, and we're going to focus that conversation around higher education, which I think a lot of you, even if you're not a university, are going to learn some really good stuff. We had a little practice round last night, so we're feeling pretty fresh. Going to get a little spicy, so we're excited about that too. I'm going to let our panel introduce themselves right after I do. My name is Daniel Akridge. I'm the Director of Engagement at Summit 7. I always joke and say we specialize in all the acronyms people love to hate. So that is our specialization. And then Kolin, I'll start with you, good sir.
Thank you. I'm Kolin Hodgson. Good morning, everybody. I'm from the University of Notre Dame, with apologies to my colleague from Duke, whom we trounced last week.
Ooh.
Sorry
I
about
thought the
that,
spicy
Jay.
was going to come a little bit later.
Not even at the compliance level.
I am the program manager for regulated research compliance and security, and I have 20 years in information security, and I'm still on the information security team for the university.
Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Epley. I'm with the University of Arizona. That's this and not this, but I did graduate from this. So I am a principal analyst in the Information Security Office Governance, Risk, and Compliance team. That's quite the mouthful, so we usually say ISO GRC. Before coming to ISO GRC, I did work in export controls, and I have been a part of higher education since 2011. But export controls has been my world for 15 years, and now also information security for the last 4 years. So, Melissa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Kimble, and I work at the Advanced Research Computing, Security, and Information Management unit at the University of Maine, ARCSIM. My position is Research Data Security Analyst, and I work both with my unit and with the Information Security Office.
Hi, I'm Jay Gallman. I'm with Duke University. I've been in higher ed all my life. I never figured out how to get off of a campus. Even when I retired from one, I went back to a second one to see if I can retire again. I'm a risk advisor at Duke. I do a little bit of everything. Obviously, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about this morning, do vendor risk analysis, a little outreach. Next week, it's my turn to be on call for the team. So,
Very good. Well, a lot of organizations, even though if they're not higher ed, don't understand the true impact of all that higher ed does in relation to the DoD. So I'm a numbers guy, so I did a little researching. So there's a website out there called usaspending.gov, and what I did was I just did a little search for the fiscal year of 2023, looked for universities, looked at DoD as the awarding agency, and this is the chart that popped up. You can see the latest 2023 being almost $6 billion of funding right now. Before anyone gets on my case, not all that's going to be CUI related. This is just general DoD funding that has been given to different universities. You can see it's been steadily growing since 2013, and it's not slowing down, which is kind of the next interesting chart here. So of the universities in attendance at this conference, I did a little bit of a deeper dive. So this is specifically to 2023's fiscal from the USA Spending website. And you can see from Dayton at the very top at 88 million, MIT's got something to prove. They're a billion thrown in there. Like, I don't know, even won't know what they're doing, right? So, Duke and Notre Dame and Arizona and USC and, all of the University of Maine. This is just what's represented here over the past year, fiscal year, which is crazy. So speaking of that, and, we've just did some introductions, but one of the first questions I like to ask you guys is, at your different research facilities that you operate in, any cool projects that you can talk about that you're working on that aren't, secret?
So the University of Notre Dame has a turbo machinery lab.
That sounds fun.
And it's, if you think about a room where there's a turbine engine and a wind tunnel built in, and then superheat the air to the temperature that would actually roast you if you stayed in the room. It's recommended that you don't stay in the wind tunnel, and there are alarms, and everybody's very vigilant about that. Security's really tight around those rooms. But it's pretty exciting to see all of the new innovations in air flight that come from those research projects.
Very cool.
At the University of Arizona, we have a lot of neat things going on. You probably saw a couple weeks ago the OSIRIS-REx mission returning with its payload, and it is off on its next assignment. But space is a big thing for the University of Arizona, and earlier this year we did open our Applied Research Building, and within that building is a Mission Operations Center. And we are learning how to deal with CUI with mission centers.
That's awesome.
So at the University of Maine, well, the work I do supports the funding of projects that involve, say, printing on one of the world's largest 3D printers. They've printed a house. They've printed a boat.
Wow, okay.
To digital twins, which is, say, where you would simulate a change on, say, an enclave, to characterizing snowpack in the Arctic, which has similar issues of if you're transmitting information.
CUI,
how do you control it?
hanging out.
Hello.
I'll go to one that actually resulted in us getting a call from, I won't name which organization, but said we wanted to do an audit. This was a couple of years ago. We had some research that takes place down at the coast of North Carolina, and they were doing wetland surveys on a military base, which used drones, which they construed to be potentially CUI, although it wasn't spelled out, and got into this whole back and forth with the entities that were doing the interview. Finally came down to coming up with an email from the base commander that said explicitly the areas that were being surveyed were not considered to be sensitive, and then everything went away. But that was a fun and interesting experience.
Yeah.
Nice.
Audits are always fun, aren't they?
Yeah.
Speaking of something not quite like an audit, but something that DOJ likes to do, is false claims acts. University has, Penn State, as most of us know from the good old news, recently gone over some scrutiny and how they handled DFAR 7012 adherence based on the contracts that they had. In your organization, how are you bringing in the executives or the sponsors or the people that would ultimately be in trouble, we could say, for not adhering to DFAR 7012? What are you saying to them? What's getting their attention right now outside of the Penn State situation?
I think it's been an ongoing process, and multiple years to, one, get the people to the table. And in a university, that's difficult to begin with because they're spread out all over. One of the silver linings in something like the pandemic was, here comes Zoom. Now we can have meetings more efficiently. People aren't, having to put buffers on both ends of their schedule to accommodate the meeting. So we were able to get the right parties to the table to start the dialogue, to start to get to know and form the relationships that are critical to being able to ultimately say, look, the IT security office is not going to own this. We will partner with you. We will provide expertise to help you determine what needs to be done, but that spurs entry, we'll help you figure out what it is. We're not going to own putting that in. That needs to belong to someone else at the university.
And everybody said amen to that in the audience, right? It's like cyber or CMMC is not an IT problem, right?
No.
The other, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No. And I think that's an important point, right? Is that even at U Arizona, the ISO, the Information Security Office, does not own the responsibility. And when you think about it, technology is only 10%. There's that 10-90 rule. The decision to accept a contract that has the DFARS clauses in it or is subject to CUI, the decision to establish a CUI enclave, the decisions to do the projects, et cetera, these are all business decisions. And so those decisions need to be owned by the risk owner, and that's the approach we take it. The University of Arizona's ISO, we look at it as the Audubon. We have a tool that we encourage our units to use. We brand it as UA Secure. It is a SaaS solution now, but it was designed by a former director of the Information Security Office. they can go into UA Secure and you can correlate that as being the road, right? It's the Autobahn. We give them tools and resources which are the map of where they want to go. We have a number for roadside assistance, which is our consultation practices. But how fast they get to their destination, whether it's CMMC or something else, is entirely up to them.
I will say that even, like, that's kind of the aspiration, right? The goal is to make sure leadership takes ownership, and leadership in correct positions takes ownership of different things, assigns roles. But there is constantly a tug, right? A debate that, well, we don't really understand what this cybersecurity stuff is, what these controls are, what these standards are. You're the ones who are supposed to interpret it. How can we accept the risk of these things if we don't understand it? So I find in my position, a lot of times I'm having to be the translator in the in-between, say, like a project manager or a PI, principal investigator on a grant or a contract, and leadership, because you might have somebody who is doing some highly technical work, doesn't fully understand the cybersecurity aspects, and then you have somebody who's in like a C-level position, right, that doesn't really understand either one of these things because they're just...
Oh, they don't.
The map.
That's news.
Because they're just involved in the business side of things. I'm not saying that's bad because we each have our roles to play, but ultimately, that decision needs to be owned higher up because it can't be pushed down constantly to folks who understand the things, right? Because we really don't have the power, usually in our positions, to enact the changes that need to happen to be compliant with these things.
Right, we can bring them to the truth, but we can't make them accept the truth,
Yes.
right? In terms of Penn State, and we were talking about this yesterday, and in information security and compliance, we're watching the news all the time, right? We're very plugged in. And when the Penn State story broke, I think we all immediately elevated the information to the highest levels of our university to make sure that everyone was aware that it was going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody did that. And never let a good crisis go to waste. It's not my job to create drama, but it is my job to get people to understand the implications of the risk decisions that they made. You do that every single day. And when something like Penn State pops, all it does is emphasize the risk side. So if somebody wasn't thinking about risk as they make their decisions about what money they'll spend to be compliant, what money they'll spend to be secure, this is one more piece of evidence on that risk side.
But doesn't compliance slow down research?
100%.
Shouldn't we prioritize?
If you pose that question to faculty, the answer will always be absolutely, and
Yes.
it's unacceptable.
Yeah.
The problem we run into is that often we don't know what the compliance requirements are until the work is scheduled to begin. The contract's been signed. Sometimes we get...
So you're at this side of it down here.
Yeah, we're down here. Here it is. Researcher wants to begin. Now what? And so we've been working on that because it's arranged from money has arrived. Can we start work? No, you can't. Here's what's got to be done. Versus the other end, I'm thinking about applying, and you can't go to that end and say, well, in that case, you'd have to have all these things because there's way too many proposals out there to put manpower into telling folks what they're going to do. So we're always looking to strike that balance as to when do we find out what this is about and start to take action and start to inform, and also doing that process to educate the other groups that we're working with. So the research groups that actually work with the faculty, the people signing the grants, these are the language terms that we're going to be looking for that we know have a time block that's going to need to be added into consideration as to when we can start.
Have you guys ever been committed to something that you couldn't meet on a cybersecurity perspective from researchers?
Yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Not yet. And I will say, to borrow from like the software dev side of things, the approach that we've been trying to push is kind of shift left, right? So push this more upstream so that we can actually have time and start to put together products or solutions so we can tell and, inform training and awareness of our faculty, staff. But it's challenging, right? Because it's a lot of information to understand, and it's a lot of expectation as well.
Faculty and staff have a lot of other demands on them, especially faculty. There are so many requirements just leading up to the point where they can figure out what their technology needs are going to be. They've already been through this storm, and they get to the end of the storm, and now they've got this other little storm brewing. How do I be compliant? But my answer to your question would be, it's compliance that enables that research. It's not a disabler, it's an enabler.
I think that was an interesting comment that Matt made yesterday from the Cyber AB is, hey, you're going to need CMMC to get contracts once this thing. Same thing on the grant side, right? It's like researchers are going to have to start playing ball, just like all the BD and salespeople out there that drive most of the people in this room crazy. It's like they have to get on the same page or else nobody wins.
Yep.
So
That's going to present its own problems.
yeah, it's going to be a bomb that kind of goes off
we
across the
can
board.
predict certain things about where we may need a CMMC assessment. We're talking about enclaves. We're pretty sure we know what that's going to be. That needs to be assessed. Our biggest concern, frankly, is work that can't be done in an enclave and not being able to predict where that work might land in a lab. We're not a business. We're a group of businesses. Each one does research that's quite a bit different than another. And so we don't know what we don't know, and so we can't necessarily get a CMMC certification for the unknown and then have that available. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the impact is for research you can't do in an enclave in terms of getting a CMMC certification ahead of time.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So the way that you have your enclave set up at the universities, is it one big enclave that everybody plays in? Do you do it by grant, by research, by department? How are you orchestrating and building out these environments, or what's your plan to as you continue to scale this?
Depends on the university. So all of us up here are involved in a couple of fairly large groups. The Regulated Research Community of Practice is one. It's an NSF.
If you're not in it and you're in higher ed, get in.
Get in it, yes. That's an NSF-funded effort. We've got a Slack channel. Quite frankly, it's how most of us keep track of what's going on, is at least one person will see the Penn State thing, post it, and the rest of us can grab it and go. And so it's this constant collaboration. Hey, what are you doing about this control, that sort of thing. And so there's kind of a gamut. There's EDUCAUSE has got a community group for 800-171. I'm one of the leaders for that. And so it's this constant bringing together. I think you'll find it runs a range depending on how that funding we were looking at spreads out. We're small. We think we'll be able to do it in a single enclave. I suspect those like an MIT probably isn't sticking everything in a single enclave.
Right.
And it's important to also keep aware of some of the other regulations that are impacting. We've got the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, that we're keeping an eye on and
That's
watching
CUI,
that.
right?
That will be CUI, yeah.
Yep.
And
So
CUI related to what kind of CUI?
federal tax information.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're keeping an eye on that and how that's going to impact whether or not that needs to somehow get tied into our CUI enclave or what, but that's for somebody at a much higher level than I do. Another resource that I stay involved in, only because it's been my world for 15 years, is an international network of export control regimes. And just last week, I was appointed as Deputy Managing Director for the American Sanctions and Export Control Society. So these are, it's important. There is a lot of overlap from at least what I've seen with the export controls and CUI for obvious reasons with DoD, but there are 125 categories of information that can be considered CUI. So it may not just be one particular area that you're thinking about. It may not be just DoD.
Right, institutions, because of the diversity, both in geographic, like where you're doing your research, who you're doing your research with, it's kind of like collecting cards. And every single day, you get a new card.
Got to
You get
catch
a
them
pack
all.
of cards.
Right.
And you don't get to discard.
And you don't get discard, and you have to go and look at your card, and you have to look at, okay, what regulation do I need to read for this particular card? Okay, what's required for this particular card to use it? Okay.
Go fish.
Go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so
It's not an
univers-
acceptable answer.
It is not.
No.
No, it's not. They need a definitive answer. For universities, the enclave makes sense. My university, it's not a business. There's 300 businesses under one roof. We have a world-class sports venue. We have a 5-star hotel. We have the fire department, the police department. We've got 300 restaurants or so, right? And retail spaces on campus. And on a busy weekend, we have an extra 180,000 people show up. So an enclave is really a good choice. So universities tend to gravitate there because the choice to make the entire university CMMC compliant is probably not a practical choice.
No.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because people that do enclaves, the question that we get asked all of the time is, but I want to collaborate. Compliance and collaboration do not seem to coexist very well, especially in the higher ed space, because when we're talking about regulated data, like export control data, there's a lot of non-US persons or even non-US citizens, depending on the type of export control, that they could potentially have exposure to because they might be a grad student, right? Versus commercial spaces that might not face that challenge as frequently.
Yeah,
How are you solving that problem?
That one tends not to be so much a technical problem,
Okay.
because we can use group management, those sorts of things, and do the non-IT vetting as to who is and who isn't allowed to be in the group and rely on that being done appropriately. Where things get interesting is actually the endpoint and the person getting access to the enclave. If we've got something in there that's going to be export control, for example, now at a university you have to start considering where your graduate students are seated. You know, now you can't just have a bullpen where a faculty member has all of their graduate students, which may be a mix of US and foreign nationals. Now they may have, depending on this project work, the consideration of how can I create a bullpen that doesn't have these. And so there are a lot of things that I think it takes the first couple of times this comes up for universities to start thinking, wow, we really have to think about a lot more than just the technical pieces of it.
Right, and that is not uppermost in the principal investigator's mind.
No.
Where are all my grad students from? Not necessarily something they thought about in advance. So when you have a circumstance like that, you have to raise the issue to the right place. And if, as an institution, you haven't been practiced at that, you need to become practiced. Yeah.
I'm turning my gears back of an age of a grad student, and I'm thinking about BYOD, and I'm thinking about the ease of access to do things. Do you guys face BYOD issues or people doing things in a vacuum where you find out 12 months later, oh, they were doing research on their Hotmail account through an Azure subscription or something of that level? Things like that float to the surface at all?
That's an ongoing reality. I think one of the things that is starting to bring it to the forefront is if we look at NSPM 33, which will apply to universities that have $50 million in annual funding from the government,
Or more.
suddenly all of that is going to be subject to what's equivalent basically of CMMC level 1.
Okay, wow.
And there are enough controls in that set that, in my opinion, and I think it's shared by some of us on the stage, that can't be met on a BYOD platform. Right. And yet, most of us rely on graduate students and their personal compute to get the research done on a day in and day out basis.
It's a broader issue all over campus.
I will agree that is a large issue, and there are for an enclave approach where we have a completely separate Active Directory. They have to have managed computers, using Intune policies to force compliance before you can access a team that's restricted, right? I'm not trying to sell Microsoft.
You can come to our next talks.
But we do have some, technical controls to help with that. But just the foundation of graduate students, as somebody who is still currently a graduate student, the assumption is you bring your computer and you do your research on your computer. For controlled projects, they're at this point, at least at our institution, it's like, okay, we have to provide a workstation for our students so that they can do research that's controlled. But with NSPM 33, with it being equivalent to CMMC level 1, and essentially you can't have an unmanaged device, and that it prove me wrong, but going through those requirements, it's extremely challenging to do a BYOD, like bring your own device thing. So you have people who don't budget for that because they've never had to.
Yeah.
You have certain granting institutions now making a statement, like moving in the direction of, we won't approve purchasing of laptops on your grant. So where does the money come from to provide these resources to students to continue to do research?
Well, you make a good point, because you may end up needing to have 2 laptops, right? So I'm a grad student. I can do all my work here, but there's this 10% of work that I need to do over here. And you also mentioned, now I have Active Directory duplicated over here. I think Jay's got a term for that.
So basically, we in higher ed are becoming Noah's Ark. We have to have 2 of everything.
Yep.
At Duke, we've just moved Splunk to the cloud. Well, gee, guess what? We certainly didn't pay for FedRAMP to cover all of our Splunk needs for campus. Now we've got a portion that, as we look at the regulations and what the requirements are, requires Splunk GovCrowd. Same for our EDR solution. If we're in Active Directory, we're looking at that. And so we are Noah's Ark. We're going to have 2 of everything. And it's not just having 2 of everything. Our good friends from Microsoft certainly don't make it easy for you to take a graduate student and constantly bounce them from one tenant to the other. And I will candidly say, when I ask them, what's the solution? Well, identify where they most likely belong and then put that entire body into that thing. There's like, no, you can't put all your graduate students in that higher cost tenant. So that's really the harder issues that we're grappling with, and not necessarily individual controls. Sure, there are a couple of them that give us a little bit of pain, but it's the bigger picture problems. And until certain things are settled, and we know for sure, none of us on this stage are going to advocate go spend another 6-figure amount on something because we think that's what the case is going to be.
Right, especially if we already have it.
Yeah.
Buy a second one. You need that 3rd car. You need that second home. You need.
Where's that
Right.
buy one, get one free discount?
That'd be
please?
great.
Blue light special, come on, guys.
That'd be great.
Splunk, what are you doing?
Because
It's already expensive. I don't even want to know what GovCloud runs.
Yeah.
But you have to essentially have an island, which means you have to have the people who can run that island, right, with a different skill set potentially than the skill set that they were utilizing for your other base of operations, right?
And you may have ITARs, so they may need to be U.S. persons, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to build to the highest level of compliance.
So let's talk about that. Are any of you using managed service providers to offset the duplicate tool sets, maybe because of the U.S. person requirement that you can't support an internal shared services at the university?
We've had to.
Had to.
Because we couldn't afford to essentially pay salaries for additional folks to come in. I mean, afford. This is all leadership decisions.
Sure. You have to get double of everything, technology and people to some degree, right?
Yep.
Now, even if somebody is an expert at managing one of the services I mentioned, there's an additional workload to doing twice of it.
Yep.
You know, if you've written scripts in one environment, now you've got to go and write them over because you probably can't just duplicate them left and right, and they're going to be slightly different for that environment. So,
And turnover is there
interesting.
too. And to find the people with the right skills that understand not just how do we make something FIPS compliant, but how do we have somebody that actually understands. We're getting spicy, aren't we?
We are.
Yeah.
FIPS,
Validated.
the four-letter word, right?
But how do we get somebody that does understand NIST 800-171? Because what is required in 866 for HIPAA is not the same thing. And so, so I think it's not just the government that's struggling with retaining talent, higher ed is too.
It's one of the many compliance problems on campus.
Yeah.
Last time I counted, there were 160 or so different requirements. I mean, we have IRS requirements, Gramley's Bliley, and just about every compliance you can imagine having, we have. We have NCAA compliance, right? Nobody's going to ignore that.
No.
So if you're going to spend money on some compliance thing, what's the flavor of the month? Well, the thing that pops
Right now, it's
up-
football flavor.
Right.
Football flavor,
Yeah.
right? It's always football flavor.
Roll Tide.
So your yeah, that's right.
Sorry.
So your CMMC project is one of the many compliance projects on the plate. at any
Screaming for
given time.
attention.
Yeah.
And looking at those funding numbers, it seems like it's a lot of money for some universities they should want to pay attention.
Yeah.
It's not NCAA money, but I mean, it's still pretty good money, right? The universities, and talking to a lot of them I have over the year or so, or the past couple of years, you guys have some unique challenges when it comes to enclaves as well. You have some technology or some systems that might be a little different than, Joe Blow machine shop right there making, 50-person manufacturing company. Can you explain a little bit of the challenges, maybe more unique to higher ed and some of those systems?
Part of it goes to understanding what the researcher's doing and the nature of the data, because one of the bigger problems is ingress and egress into your enclave. And is this a one-time thing? Is this a regular thing? Going back to your question of, is there collaboration involved? Trying to manage the collaboration. Let's say that football aside, Duke and Notre Dame decided to work on something, and with Arizona, and we needed to be moving data around. How big is that data? Are these large data sets, or are they just documents? And so that's a constant unknown that we're trying to figure out. And then, will the solution actually work? Sometimes we don't know until we get a chance to test it out and see, and that's
By then the
pretty
grant's
far
already
down the
been
line.
awarded, right?
Yeah.
It's like
That's pretty far down
that's
the
a
line.
fallout problem.
And that's just data. That doesn't count equipment that has been flagged by the government to say it's going to be processing or creating CUI. So now throw that into the mix as well. How do you control the equipment, and are there other regulations that you need to consider that come along with that piece of equipment? Is there IP involved? Is it being created and developed? Who's going to own that IP? And there's a lot of different things that need to go into understanding. It's not just CMMC, it's not just 800-171. It could be export controls, it could be IP, it could be other privacy like GDPR. There is just a number of different compliance areas that need to be considered. And there's a number of compliance partners, at least for the University of Arizona, that sometimes have to get involved in hashing out their particular area of responsibility.
All those things are on Melissa's card.
Miss Lish.
Yeah.
Here you go,
card
Melissa.
for
Go
that.
fish.
The card deck.
What do you guys do for like non-standard systems, right? Under CMMC, we think specialized assets, right?
Pray.
OT, IoT,
Yep.
pray.
Well, so okay.
A couple
for
Hail Marys, right? Just in case.
The nature of research, right, is you have a Frankenstein monster that does something really cool, right? Comes back to life
Prints a
from special
house,
organs.
right?
Listen it.
And so you have this operational technology, right? And I mean, if you read the scoping guidance and it tells you, hey, OT just needs to be documented within your SSP. But then you're sitting there and thinking, when my assessor comes in and reviews this, and looks at the safeguards, the additional safeguards that we have in place, will this be sufficient? I don't know. And we can put as much as we can in place, but we also can't prohibit or restrict them in such a way that they can't even use the equipment, right? Especially when the work that's being done on that equipment is being funded by a contract that has DFAR 7012, 7020 in it, and the contract that you have has essentially designated that work as CUI. I just want to like soapbox for a second here. We use CUI a lot, the word CUI, right? DFARS is controlled technical information. It's a category of CUI. And so what I see at our institution is, and then as we know, 7012 is what triggers 800-171. 7020 triggers the like basic assessment and all that kind of stuff, right? So I see at our institution some confusion with the use of the word CUI, right? Because they think CUI, oh, then you have all these requirements. But scoping becomes so important because it's expensive. So if we think everything is CUI, then we're going to put everything in scope. But if we reframe this to say, hey, this is controlled technical information, it is a type of CUI. This is export controlled information, which is also a type of CUI. Then it helps better understand what the requirements are. And
especially
then maybe,
in a lab.
Especially in a lab, and especially when we have to mark information, when we have the onus and the burden to mark our stuff because we're not getting guidance.
So, about to say, do you guys get any guidance? I always say CYA with CUI, right? It's like everyone seems to be doing that right now. Have you gotten any traction with contracting officers or even primes you might work with around, hey, what do we do with this information?
There's a negotiation that has to happen.
Yes.
I think for a lot of us, we're still in the phase of trying to get clearer identification in the contract as it comes in as to specifically what is the CUI. And it's not there, and it becomes this back and forth to try and get what it is. I think, to Melissa's point, one of the approaches I think we can take is try to figure out how to make as much stuff as possible, especially in the lab, not CUI.
Yeah.
You know, if I have these results and I don't know what they actually belong to, say I've got a series of samples, but I don't know what's what, walking away with my test results isn't going to necessarily tell anybody anything, especially if it's a standard test that you perform on all sorts of things. So let's look at the data flows carefully to try and segment out and bring that CUI scope in as close and as small as we can to make our job a little bit easier.
And so that kind of, just as a, what
Are you back
we're
on the
referencing
soapbox?
here- No, it's
Oh,
no
okay.
soapbox, but kind of, it's just like taking from HIPAA, right? So HIPAA, if you anonymize your information, then HIPAA doesn't apply. And I'm not,
That's a little scary, but I get it.
it's part, it says it in the regulation itself, that if you anonymize your information, then HIPAA doesn't, like, it apply.
But there's a whole science behind actually carrying that out.
Yes, so there are standards that you have to follow to make sure you are truly anonymizing it. GDPR has the same thing, but they have pseudo-anonymization.
There you
Saying
go.
that wrong? And versus actual anonymization. Theirs have a higher standard. And if we could get to that point, as Jay was saying, with controlled technical information / CUI,
you can know what's what, right? You can map it and you can see where it applies. So there's non-contextualized data, right? Like that raw output from a machine or from a lab that says at 8:01 and 10 seconds it was 500 degrees. At 8:01 and 11 seconds it was 502 degrees. There's no CUI there. There's no controlled technical information in a list of temperatures.
Unless you chose to name the file, the sample identification. and
Right,
other
for a
stuff.
controlled item, right?
But it seems like it's easier to get a speaker ousted than it is to actually understand what the government, how the government identifies information, right? And that is part of our struggle as well, is what is the soup du jour, if you will, of a control officer or a compliance officer at a government agency. And you seem to get varying whatever card they have.
Just call it until you get the answer you want and move on.
Yeah, so there's a lot of inconsistencies in how we're also being advised on when a particular regulation or a particular control needs to be implemented. And that makes things frustrating for higher ed as well.
So I'm going to ask this kind of a two-part question. Let's say you have a meeting with either, the Cyber AB or the DoD CIO, or it could be both. What's one question that you would want to ask them to, for the love of God, please improve or help us in this thing?
Well, the Cyber AB has an academic advisory group.
Which, that was the first time I heard that yesterday, by the way. That was news to me as well. So
There is an academic advisory group, a committee, and I would love to know what's going on with it because I haven't heard a peep. Is Matt in the room?
oh, boo, Matt.
But
Left the room.
Come on, Matt.
In any case, I would love to know what's going on with that because it seems that inquiries, at least that I make personally, into that committee or requests for subcommittees that the AAC made to the regulated research community of practice earlier in the spring, it's just gone into this black hole.
Right.
So I would really, really like to know what's there because I know at least 4 people that are willing to help.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there's a lot more.
Contracting officers need help too. This is a difficult thing to understand and apply, and there needs to be some education or some resources for them so that they can come to the table and we can have a mutual understanding.
So something that I remember from Huntsville was that there was like a panel with, I think it was Jacob, and there was a contracting officer or a former contracting officer. And she mentioned at one point that sometimes she's able to, speak to her subject matter experts on things. And I don't know if that's a normal resource for contracting officers, but I think it's an unfair expectation for them to be able to look through, interpret a statement of work, and say, yes, this phase of your statement of work is distro A, or give us a fundamental research characterization. It's just, this is research, right?
Yeah.
It's challenging, right. And I think that's kind of maybe the response that a lot of times we get. Depends on the contracting officer that you receive to be able to get one that can actually confidently, without feeling like they're taking on, too much responsibility or risk or uncertainty, and giving you these distro statements or designations within your contract. So my question, I guess, would be what resources are being provided to contracting officers? Is it a regular thing, or is it that they're just going above and beyond and finding these subject matter experts that they can what is it, dial a friend,
Lifeline.
Lifeline.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be standard and part of the process, as opposed to that's just what somebody did in their extra time to build up their network.
And I think I'll build on some of what that's already been said, and that is get the DoD to be more definitive in terms of what in a contract is the actual CUI, what the marking should be, because the other thing that's very difficult for us to do is become markings experts.
Yeah.
If you look at the only CUI training that the government offers right now, it really shows its genesis rather from a paper document era. Yep. Yeah, I can figure out what you probably should mark your final report or your presentation files. I don't know what the hell you do with a huge data set, or if you do anything.
Yep. So if there was a university that has either just started or hasn't even started yet this journey towards adhering to, that DFAR 7012 thing that's been around for a little while, any sage advice that you would give them before we're going to do a reverse Q&A real quick and then let you guys ask some assessors questions?
So 2 things. shift left, what we're talking about before, try to push everything up the chain so that you can educate your researchers, have it in your contracts so that you can negotiate early on, right? And then that's a hard ask too for institutions where you don't have the staff that are already like overburdened with information, right? And I think the other thing is scoping. We mentioned before, scoping is so important, understanding where things are, data flow diagrams, doing that exercise, like if you get the contract, anyways, before the contract, like instructing your researchers, hey, make it a regular standard practice for your research to put together a data flow diagram for every project. That way you have it up front.
And I would say ask questions. Have those conversations. If it's not clear, continue to ask the questions until it is clear. And often what you will find is what somebody thinks on one side of the table is CUI. Once you start examining and you start asking those questions, you actually find out, no, it's probably not CUI.
Be careful signing things and submitting SPUR scores that you don't actually know. That's the advice that I keep hearing for pretty much anybody at this point.
Be truthful, be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Due diligence.
Due diligence. So how many assessors, by assessors I mean CCAs, do we have in the audience? Can we get a little show of hands? We got 1, we got 2, we got 3, 4, 5, we got all sorts of them. So before we get into your questions, which should be really fun and hopefully spicy as well, do you guys want to ask an assessor anything? We got a room full of them.
I got.
Okay.
Question.
All right, I'll go first. My question would be, since higher ed is a beast and sort of a unique situation, would it make sense for assessors to specialize?
Okay. Any CCAs want to jump in on that? Should there be...
Before you take the question, just try to keep it brief if you can, if
Yeah.
you're a CCA. Thanks.
30 seconds. We have one.
Find them first.
Oh, here we
have
go.
Caleb.
Morning, Caleb Lighty, Summit 7. I'll take this back actually to what I always tell assessors, right? And that is that it's your responsibility to understand the requirements, the intent of the requirements, and what's needed to meet those requirements. So whether you're going into a specialized type of organization or dealing with specialized type of technologies, if you have the key understanding of what the requirements are and what it will take to meet them, you can usually work with that organization to kind of explain what they're doing in order to meet the requirements, right? So I see it less of specializing. There are definitely benefits as well, right? If you're putting together an assessment team, I saw Mira raise her hand in here earlier. She knows about this, right? To getting those targeted folks. If you have, if you're doing a Microsoft environment, get a Microsoft specialist, those kinds of things. But as an assessor, I feel like it's your duty to understand the requirements enough to be able to compare any type of organization or technology against those requirements.
Okay.
All right. Who we got?
I think the question I would ask, and not just on behalf of higher ed, but of the DIB at large, is really start sharing out in a sanitized fashion as this process plays out. What are the things that continually start to crop up as issues, and make them publicly available so that folks can be mindful of what others have run into and try to plan. I mean, that's one of the big focuses we have in the two groups I mentioned, is as soon as somebody learns something, share that back out so that we can build on it, because each piece of information is one more step we can take forward and have some confidence in.
That's a great one. Anybody else before we switch to them? Okay,
I
Melissa.
do have a question. I don't know if it can be answered. So, okay, given we have right here, super low complexity environment, GCC high, they only use Office 365 products, no other software. That's super,
Low.
Then opposite end of that is super complex. With that in mind, what for that highly complex environment, enclave, say it's an enclave, what would be a fair amount to charge, in your opinion, not how much your business charges, but in your opinion, what would be a fair amount to charge, and how long should that take to do a CMMC Level 2 assessment?
On the basic environment or the complex? Or
Complex environment. You know what?
Kind of a range.
Give us
Small,
a range.
medium, and large.
Give
From
us a
basic
range.
to complex.
Yes.
Amira, okay.
Amira wants it.
Here we go.
Spicy
All right.
meatball
All
before lunch
right,
here.
I like it.
Okay. So I have a C3PO, right? And I'm not going to be able to be like, oh, that's $50,000 or $150 or whatever. Most C3PAOs try to gear their assessments to be about 1 week, which is probably good for 90% of the assessments, right? So from the very smallest to the most complex 90%, that 1 week still is valid. But we throw more assessors at it. So when you get more complex, instead of one person, you get 3, you get 6, right? One of my rules of thumb when I'm pricing an assessment is that there's a point when assessors cannot handle more complexity, right? So going from, say, 6 assessors to 20 assessors, there's not a whole lot of return
Diminishing
there, right?
return.
Diminishing,
Yeah.
Got it.
And it actually becomes about your policies and your procedures, your management processes, more than the individual systems. So instead of looking at every single system one by one and saying, do you do this, do you do this, do you do this, right? Times 20 systems, times 110 requirements, we're going to perhaps sample your systems and say, okay, we're going to randomly pick 5 of your systems. We're going to check those. But it's going to be much more about how are you handling your staff? Do you have a really good change management process, right? Which is so important. I say this to everyone. Change management, change management, change management. That actually will be the thing that helps you do almost all the technical stuff, is just having a good change management process, because every time you want to make a change, you go, am I doing all the requirements? Let me figure out how to do it, right? So I'm hoping I'm not going to get in trouble here.
Here it comes.
So I'm like the only C3PO that actually publishes numbers, and I've put out that the least complex assessments generally around 30,000, right? The way CMMC is designed right now. The most complex, we're talking about like that 90 percentile. 120,000, right? It doesn't get too much higher past that. We're not going to ever do like $1 million assessment.
One follow-up to that, in the process of, could you leave her the mic, because I got a follow-up?
Come on.
Hey, we
But
Jay gotcha.
hey, we do want to make sure we get Q&A.
Okay,
for the room
okay.
too.
This is a quick follow-up.
Last one.
And that is, what kind of cost are we looking at if you didn't pass it the first time and you've got to come back and fill that gap to get?
So we've done a couple joint surveillance assessments, and so I can tell you that there's all sorts of forces on the C3PAO and the assessors where we want our clients to succeed, right? It looks good, we get more clients, right? Everybody, we don't get angry people, right? It's wonderful. So we do our best to expedite that delta assessment. And in our experience when we've done it, we've actually been able to close out those last issues within like a week. So we're very much motivated to try and get that fixed.
So I think Wendy has one thing she wants to add, and then we'll go to the
let
crowd
me just
here.
make a suggestion. I am a registered practitioner advanced, and a certified CMMC professional, and I am working on a provisional instructor course as well. But let me put this out there, that engage with an RPA or a registered practitioner organization, and let them work with you to do a pre-assessment readiness review. They're going to be able to get you through these complex situations so that when you do meet with a C3 PAO to start getting ready for your assessment, they're going to be able to provide for you a conformity report. And your assessment process then is going to be streamlined. And if you go back to the Cyber AB's July town hall, you'll see, I think it was July, it could have been June, but anyway, several companies said that it took them anywhere from 3 to 7 business days to get through their assessment. And I think as long as you take that effort, you take the time, you dot the I's, cross the T's, get that conformity report in place. It doesn't matter whether it's complex or it's simple. That conformity report is going to be your ace in the hole, so to speak, to show you've done everything you possibly could.
That's awesome. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Amir, for being transparent with us. All right, Sam, over to you.
Let's do it. All right, raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, Ryan.
Oh,
I
boy.
just wanted to address the $126 billion elephant in the room, which is federal student aid. The legal prerequisites for receiving student aid as a higher ed institution is that you must prevent the disclosure of student records, letters of recommendation, admissions information, and that you must safeguard the federal or the student records used to determine federal aid status. Those laws and regs are in the CUI registry under student records.
Yeah, it's one of the 125 categories.
So forget specialized research in an enclave. What are the core functions of an actual university doing to implement 80171?
Good question.
Spicy right
We
back.
only have 4 minutes.
Yeah.
We are motivated by the hottest current fire.
Right. NCAA.
And so
There you go.
until that one is actually lit and burning, I don't know that you'll see traction because fire draws attention. Not all of us have a fire station, but
Notre Dame.
I think that will come to the forefront. I mean, we can socialize it, but it really takes threat of imminent change and negative change to sometimes get things moving.
Like a Penn State event, right?
Yeah.
A catalyst type.
You know, you start cutting off federal financial aid to some universities, I think the rest of them will take quick notice. But
And I mean, there's already FERPA that we follow, and we've got our compliance areas for that. And as far as the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act and the 9 recommendations that are there for an information security program, we're working on those. But the GLBA 9 doesn't really kick in until the 2024-2025 FAFSA cycle, which will start July 1st. So
Fast.
we have, I think the applications come out in December, but the distribution of it, and that's when it will kick in, is July 1st. So we have other fires that we're dealing with right now, but we are aware of it, and we're working to get those in place.
All right, next question.
The short version of this question is, official government CUI training is bad. What are you doing in order to try to educate your users on this problem? Are you doing anything organically?
I think
Yeah.
one of the things I would point out is that NSF met with some of us this summer because they've got in mind to start creating resources. That's one of the things we need to do in higher ed on a regular basis is not reinvent the wheel, but if we can help contribute to something that can be used by everyone and do it once, that's the approach we need to be taking.
And at the University of Arizona, I am in the process of launching a new program for our risk managers called CyBorg, Cybersecurity Body of Risk Guardians. And it will be an ecosystem of knowledge sharing that are within our institution. We are building out a very comprehensive resource that explains the back story behind things and then gives them questions to help them consider, did you do this? Have you done that? Are you looking at this? Et cetera, et cetera. And then they can go and, as part of our risk management program, go into UA Secure and now use the advanced view in developing out their risk assessment for whatever the XYZ project is that they're working on.
That's cool.
All right, let's do one more question if we have one in the room. Anybody?
Anybody? Oh,
Here we go.
got one.
All right, last one right here.
So when you were talking about this enclave, you talked about getting second computers to create a new environment. How much have you thought about moving to the next level of computing and just skipping the local computer and using a virtual instance?
Well, I think our enclaves are virtual. So
Yep.
those are VDI infrastructure typically. So we're there. I think the question is really the on-prem, hybrid, all the way into the cloud. All the way into the cloud looks nice on the pictures we've seen, but any of you who've spent time in Azure Portal know two things. That's one complex beast, and the SOB changes on a regular and consistent basis.
And the other reason why you need two devices is because you got to get the information up into that cloud environment. And so you have to have the right machine to do it. And so that's where the other machines come into play and why we need two of everything.
You're always hybrid.
Yeah.
You'll never
You got to
not
get the data
be
up to the cloud somehow, right?
Exactly.
It's got to get there.
Right.
And then
Labs
it's got to
have
get down.
data.
It's not magic?
No?
No
If you have it
unicorns.
configured correctly, it's not magic.
Yeah.
All right, well, if that's the case, I think we're wrapped up on time here. Thank you, panel. You've been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Spicy?
joining
Thank you
us.
for having
Spicy,
us.
I love it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys, and we're going to go on break.